what happened.
While I entirely take your point about Mach being a precursor of the logical positivist movement, it is true, isn't it, that in addition to there being a new logic at the turn of the century, there was also a new science. I mean, dramatically personified above all by Einstein,
Yes.
but there was this enormous breakthrough, a
Yes.
thought system of ideas which had started with Newton and which had been accepted as incorrigible fact by most of the Western world for nearly 300 years. This was beginning to break down under the influence of Einstein and the new physics, and surely that must have had an enormous impact on what they were doing.
This had a very important stimulus to them, because, in fact, Einstein had been affected by Mach. I heard it from his own mouth that he owed a great deal to Mach. And they saw Einstein's work in theory of relativity, and also they saw the new quantum theory as a vindication of their approach. Because what Einstein had done, anyhow, as they interpreted him, was to say, you can't attach any sense to something like simultaneity unless you consider how statements about simultaneity are verified. That is to say that what is meant by talking of things being simultaneous depends upon how simultaneity is actually determined in observation. And they saw this as a great vindication within science of their philosophical approach. Similarly with quantum theory, I mean, the fact that in quantum theory no meaning is attached to a particle simultaneously having a precise velocity and a precise position, because this can't be tested, because if you measure the velocity, it distorts the position. If you measure the position, it distorts the velocity. Therefore, the scientists attached no meaning to this. They said this is a proof that what scientific concepts mean is determined by how they're verified, and this is what we're saying. And so this gave them an enormous stimulus. They said, well, science is on our side, we're interpreting science properly. And they were, as I said, Carnap and Schlick were originally physicists. Neurath was a sociologist.
So in other words, now we're getting at what the revolutionary nature of their work consisted
Yes,
in,
yes.
that they were applying the new logic and the new science
Yes.
to traditional methods of thought and breaking these methods down, as it were, under the impact of the new methods. Is that so?
Well, yes, what they wanted to say was that the old philosophical problems were either senseless or else capable of being solved by purely logical techniques.
Now, what were the main doctrines that they developed in the course of doing this?
Well, there were three, really. The first, everything hinged on the so-called principle of verifiability, which was put succinctly by Schlick as the meaning of a proposition is its method of verification. And this is slightly vague as it's there expressed, and we've labored ever since somehow to make it precise, and never wholly successfully. But it had two consequences. One was that anything that couldn't be empirically verified by sense observation, was meaningless. I've already referred to this. And secondly, it was interpreted by Schlick, later it got loosened, but in the early days by Schlick, as entailing that what a proposition meant could be described, by saying what would verify it. And so you get a reduction of all statements to statements about statements of immediate observation. And this was the first point, which had both negative and a positive side. Negative as excluding metaphysics, positive as showing a way of analyzing what the statements that were significant. Then they held, this they got partly from Wittgenstein, but there is evidence that Schlick discovered this on his own, that the propositions of logic and mathematics, necessarily true statements, were what Wittgenstein called tautologies. They said the same thing over again, as it were. I mean, they
merely unpacked the content of what was already.
Yes, like saying all bachelors are unmarried men, or all brothers are male. That all logic and mathematics simply was what Kant had called analytic. That's to say, as you put it, unpacking the content of what you've already said. And then the third main thing was about philosophy itself. They thought that philosophy must consist in what Wittgenstein and Schlick called an activity of elucidation. I mean, I think there was a saying of Wittgenstein, which was quoted again by Schlick, that philosophy is not a doctrine but an activity. It doesn't issue in a body of true or false propositions, because this is covered by the sciences, but simply is the activity of clarifying, analyzing, and in certain cases exposing nonsense. I mean, Wittgenstein, at the end of his famous book, The Tractatus, had said, the right method of philosophy is simply to wait till somebody says something metaphysical, then show him it is nonsense. which is a bit, of course, negative and discouraging for
yeah.
a philosopher.
Well, now, taking off the first of those 3 points first, I think it'll be fairly clear to most people what's meant by the view that any statement about the world must make some observable difference to something if it's true.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's difficult to see how it can have any application.
Yes.
When you say that the meaning of a statement consists in the method by which you verify it, I think that's probably not clear to some of the people who are listening to this discussion. Can you explain that a bit?
Yes, I can. Originally, it was thought by Schlick and by Mach before him, and possibly also by Wittgenstein, though it's not quite clear what Wittgenstein's atomic elementary statements are meant to be, that you could translate out all statements into statements about sense data, about immediate data of observation. And this was never actually achieved, and clearly runs into very great difficulties, for instance, in the case of universal propositions saying all ravens are black. I mean, all gases expand when heated, because the range covered by the all might be infinite. And of course, if it's infinite, then you couldn't possibly translate out. And so they then were driven to rather desperate expedients. Schlick actually said that statements of this kind weren't propositions at all, but rules, simply rules from getting from one particular statement, this raven is black, this is a raven, to this is black, and so on, rules of inference. And then there were other difficulties. I mean, clearly, it seemed perfectly clear that if you take very high-level, abstract scientific propositions about atoms, electrons, nuclei, and so on, to try and write this out in terms of sensations, in terms of blues and rounds and warm feelings of warmth and so on, it simply doesn't work. And for various reasons, then, the principle got weakened, and it was the idea that you could translate out became given up, and all it was required was that these propositions, to be significant, should be confirmable by sense observation. And this meant that their meaning remained sort of partially undetermined. That it was thought that they got meaning from the cases where they were in fact confirmed, where the test could be carried out, and the rest was left rather vague. Also, this original view led to very implausible views, for example, about the past, because statements about the past were equated with the evidence we could now get for them. So saying Caesar crossed the Rubicon was found actually to mean if I look up in the such a history book, I will see it written, or if I go and dig, I will find such and such relics and so on. And I actually put forward this view in Language, Truth and Logic. It now seems desperately implausible to me. And again, there's a difficulty about other minds, of course. If I say that you're feeling such and such, I can only observe your behavior, and in the early days, the Viennese wanted to say that all those statements meant was statements about people's behavior. That again became doubted. So I think that the verification principle in its strong form really didn't last very long.